Hey everyone, it's been a couple of weeks now. I took a holiday in the lands between for the second time since 2022, and have been tearing what's left of my hair out in the new DLC that came out this year, Shadow of the Erdtree. The expansion was something that I enjoyed for the most part. While there were other aspects that I didn't like and some bosses I hated fighting, I still enjoyed it for the most part. I've always been a fan of the Souls series since the first Dark Souls, and the games have been pretty consistent in quality over the years. Since then, we've had plenty of other Souls-like games that have varied in terms of personal enjoyment. But after playing through Elden Ring's DLC, I started thinking about what can make rage-inducing games still enjoyable, even though there are times that they make you want to uninstall. As I said in my Dark Souls 1 video, it was the game that made me appreciate difficult and challenging games more than before. It made me see that a hard or challenging game could still be fun. In retrospect though, the game for me isn't that hard for me anymore, and is more of a unique experience that punishes people for not adapting to its mechanics or its environment. Not everyone though wants to fail for hours on end, but everyone on some level does appreciate a certain degree of challenge. Not every game though is made for the player necessarily, and some rage-baiting games I've seen have been geared more towards the viewer's experience rather than the player's. You make an Alt F4 or an only up game, something that will pique a streamer's attention or a content creator's attention, and then they inject their own experience for the viewers. Said viewers then have more fun watching the streamer rage than they themselves would if they were playing the game. Some games that are genuinely well made though do sometimes fall into this trend, but aren't necessarily made to the point where it's more fun to watch than play. Say if you were to make a hard and challenging game yourself, what would you then need to do in order to make an enjoyable experience that makes you want to play it, even in spite of its difficulties? Well, think about what is challenging and fair. Challenging and fair will vary amongst different people, but to boil it down, it's a way of introducing a challenge that may seem impossible at first, but your chances of winning are also likely. In Sekiro, the enemies all have their own unique patterns and attacks, but you always have the means to beat them because of the tools provided. Even if you have no upgrades whatsoever for your character, you still have the means to win. Traditional difficulty settings though tip the scales of fairness, where some on the hardest of settings can be borderline unfair due to the arbitrary application of stats and enemy behavior. Making something hard for the sake of hard though is never a good route to go for making challenging games. You must make the player feel like that they have a fighting chance no matter what position they're in or what situation they're in. The Souls games have people beating the entire game without ever leveling up or even upgrading or using magic. People come up with all different kinds of ways of experimenting while still having a good chance of overcoming the odds. Is it harder to do things this way? Of course. But is it still fair and can it still be fun? Of course. The enemies don't necessarily change in the FromSoft games, only your behavior and actions towards them, and as well as the way you approach the game. Classic Doom's Nightmare mode though is unfair on purpose out of being a joke, and for a serious playthrough of it, it's awful because you have to then treat it like a speedrun because of the circumstances surrounding it. The enemies respawn, some enemies in particular are much faster, and they already hit like a truck, and even more so in Nightmare. Doom 2016 and Doom Eternal, however, has a Nightmare mode that's more manageable in comparison, even with the high damage counts that the player takes. However, the enemies don't exactly change a great deal, and you don't have the respawning factor of the enemies, or even the depletion of health over time like in Doom 3's Nightmare mode. It's still a manageable and fair difficulty mode that can still be enjoyable. It's not always the game, but also how you approach the game's challenge. Some people do actually like unbalanced and unfair challenges, and there's even mods that provide said challenges for those type of players because the desire for challenge is unique to the individual, and there's always people looking for the next hard obstacle to overcome. But if your goal is to make something challenging and fair, then you need to approach the difficulty in a way that makes it so that the player can realize the mistakes and believe that they can still do it regardless of what position they are in the game. Punish the player for making a mistake, but don't punish them for existing in the world. The best difficulty system I've seen personally is the difficulty modifier system. This system enables players to customize their own difficulty. Games like Mountain Blade, Amnesia the Bunker, Stalker Anomaly, and Zero Sievert are good examples of this system, where you can go from a casual and easy experience to something more hardcore to straight up bullshit and unfair. Some games, most notably the FromSoft games, don't have a traditional difficulty system, but are just challenging by nature, made in a way for the player to engage in its own world and eventually triumph in it. But after the Elden Ring DLC, it's now starting to border on just being hard for the sake of it because if they tone things down, people may not enjoy them anymore. And I don't know if that's for certain, but it feels like that's becoming the case. And I hope that they don't go the route where everything is just going to be borderline impossible, just because they have to always keep scaling the difficulty further and further up just for people to enjoy them. Make your game challenging and make players want to overcome the obstacle, and also provide flexibility, something that the Souls games do a good job at once realized. If you cast aside difficulty selections, then start your game from being manageable to being hard towards the end as the player's experience in the game develops. However, even if your game does provide a fair challenge, it won't mean anything if your controls aren't well implemented. Nowadays, I find controls to be the catalyst that determines whether I'll enjoy a game or not. If it plays like shit and the controls are bad, I won't beat my head against the wall and play it again. It's not something I tolerate anymore, and the game will be an instant dodge if I don't like the controls. During the development phase, it's important to make a game feel seamless to get into, through comprehensible tutorials that give clear and concise information to the core mechanics, as well as a simple to use but customizable control scheme. Bugs are a side effect that can be treated once properly identified, but can also be a hurdle that can break other aspects if not treated carefully, keeping the code in check. The more polish is applied to your gameplay, the more enjoyable it becomes. Platformers require good movement, shooters require good gunplay, strategy games require good interfaces to multitask with. Each genre will adhere to specific needs that play to their strengths, but ultimately, if your goal is to make something challenging, it needs to feel good to play, it needs to be easy to access and interface with, and that means ironing out the control scheme, the HUD, the transitions between animations, reading inputs and response time between said inputs. Games made by solo developers or smaller studios can still cook a well-made product, but it will take more time naturally. This also means more active engagement with the community is needed to ensure a good quality product. Bigger games, however, though made with bigger studios, you're often at the mercy of the studio noticing the concerns raised by the community, and sometimes hoping to wait that a patch will fix said issues. And some games, some big titles, have had issues that have been existing for years, and the companies just haven't touched them at all. But with smaller games, it's not always the case, and you more than likely will get some results and feedback from the developer to fix said issues. Studios get playtesters to iron out bugs that they haven't noticed, and using that feedback, they can then fix the issues later. Don't ignore the method and the benefits of playtesting. If you have a playable product, distribute it as a playtest and give out access for a period of time. Afterwards, you should then know where you stand with the product. Testing things out yourself can still be good, but equally it's also flawed because you're not just making the game for yourself, but for other people too. Take notes from games where the controls and the movement are praised, analyze them on a technical level, and figure out why it works that way. And don't just look at good games, also look at the bad ones too. Games that feel janky and terrible to play. Even they have their own place in the pursuit of game development, and you can't improve as a developer without seeing both sides of the same coin. So, nail your controls and make sure it feels good to pick up and play, and don't overcomplicate the control scheme too much. And not just controls, but also the mechanics. Games with overcomplicated mechanics often get dropped by a lot of people because too much time is spent trying to understand those mechanics rather than being able to enjoy the rest of the game. Some of the best games I've played have mechanics that are easy to understand and are difficult to master. Games like Counter-Strike and Rocket League are games that are easy to understand but are hard to master because of all the variables surrounding their mechanics. There are people who have thousands of hours in these games and are still terrible at them. The FromSoft games have a number of mechanics that can be mastered over time, but takes a lot of trial and error, and there are few people that can complete these games without taking a single hit. Mechanics are a core element and make up the components in the gameplay, and sometimes manifest as challenges to be conquered. You can go even deeper with games like Dwarf Fortress, one of the most complex games out there, or even some of the Zachtronics games, and see how far the rabbit hole goes with them. But not everyone is coming home from work to play these type of games, and not everyone wants to have something overly complex. They want something that is easy enough to get into initially, while being presented with challenges over time. Some do believe that the more complex something is, the better. Now, in some cases this is true, but in the beginning this is not necessarily the case, because your game needs to have a gentler introduction for people to get some level of success in order to appreciate the challenges that come later. Part of the process is having a good explanation of mechanics as they get introduced to you, and even provide opportunities to practice those mechanics from time to time. Doom Eternal does a great job of showing the player how useful mods can be against enemies. In the first level, you get introduced to the Arachnotron or the Cacodemon. You already have the means to cancel them out pretty quickly. An explosive shot to the turret or full auto will delete them, or an explosive shot in the Cacodemon's mouth to put them in a glory kill state. You have different ways of approaching these enemies, but immediately from the get-go, you already have the means to cancel them out quickly, like I said. Mechanics need to be in service of the overall experience to enhance it and enrich in the loop that has been crafted, and not made to overcomplicate things needlessly. It's like with the Chekhov's gun principle: if you put something in a scenario that is irrelevant, doesn't get used, or isn't mentioned, then it needs to have a place later on. If not, then remove it at once. Start with simple mechanics first, and then add on top of it later on as the player progresses in experience. Also, not every mechanic will be a perfect match either. It wouldn't make sense to make a platformer game with grand strategy mechanics. Like, how does that even work? If they don't synergize properly, then it needs to either be modified or removed entirely. If you can't explain your mechanic in layman's terms, then it needs to be reassessed. When it comes to being punished for making mistakes, people have different reactions to those mistakes, and as well as the punishments that come with them. When I'm being punished for situations outside of my control, it lessens the experience for me and it becomes more frustrating than fun. But whenever I die in games like Sekiro, it's generally my fault due to either misreading the enemy's intentions or mistiming my actions. Some games punish you on the basis of luck or circumstances, something that is prominent in roguelike games, a side effect of their randomized nature. Games like Fear and Hunger is another game where more often than not, you're at the mercy of chance, and it doesn't always make for a fun and fair experience. If you're going to make something masochistically hard, then you need to also consider the punishment for failure and how you can make things better for the player next time. Games like Risk of Rain 2 punish the players with having to restart the run again, but in saying that, you receive new items and characters that can make the next run easier, so you have an incentive to keep trying over and over again to unlock more things. Traditional roguelikes, however, are different because when you lose, you start all over again with nothing in return, and the only thing you yield from that run is experience. Setbacks are a result of failure in a game, but how far you will set the player back is another thing. Out of the ELDEN Soulsborne games, Elden Ring is very forgiving because most of the time the bosses are close to the sites of grace, or checkpoints. In Demon Souls though, it was genuinely awful having to tread through the Shrine of Storms in the Valley of Defilement, and it felt like a bigger punishment every time I died, just so that I could get to the boss room for another attempt, only to then die and then have to tread my ass all the way back to the Fog Gate. It was fine when it came out, but now it just sucks and I just don't enjoy it that much anymore. When it comes to permadeath, it either needs to be optional or that it yields rewards to unlock more content in the next run like in roguelike games. Don't make an easy game with hard punishment or a hard game with hard punishment, but somewhere in the middle that scales over time with the player's experience. Towards the later stages of the game, the punishments for failure need to come more from skill checks of the player rather than things outside of their control and things that they can't do anything about. Some games require more patience, of course, but there still needs to be some degree of progression, and the setbacks shouldn't be too harsh in the first place to deter the player from trying again. If Dark Souls made it so that you had to start the whole game all over again after dying, the burnout would appear much quicker, and the game wouldn't be as enjoyable. Understand the kind of game you're trying to make and have systems in place to alleviate the punishments for a player. If it's a regular game, have options for further punishments. If the player wants to make things harder for themselves, then that is their choice. But in the end, if you want a larger audience but still want to make a challenging game, then it needs to be an obstacle course with rewarding and fun gameplay and not a torture device that makes you want to kill yourself. A good way to motivate players to keep trying is having good reward systems in place. It could be, new gear or new items, lots of experience. It could be like a leaderboard system or cosmetic items that you can unlock, or even just, achievements. It's the cherry on the top that adds more to your game, especially if people are already enjoying it. And these are important things to keep in mind for further returns of more playthroughs. And finally, don't just make the game fun to watch, make it fun to play. There are a lot of games that are more fun to watch than play because the reactions from content creators providing their own experience of the game without the viewers needing to, engage in it themselves turns out to be more enjoyable than actually playing the game itself. And when you do play the game yourself, the experience not only isn't the same, but it isn't as fun. But when you play something like Celeste or even Geometry Dash, they're games that are fine-tuned, very well made, are fun to watch and fun to play because of how much effort was put into those projects. They believed in what they were making, and the difficulty is dynamic due to not just the progression system of how the levels are staged, but also the means of creating your own content as well, especially in Geometry Dash, where you can go from, casual runs to overly difficult runs. But when I see games like Alt F4 and Only Up, I see it as a cobbled mess that's playable enough for streamers to pick up and for viewers to have a fun time watching. And sure, some well-crafted games also become a viewing experience as well, where some people would rather watch than play, but those viewers watch to engage with the streamer more so than to watch the game, When people watched Kai Cenat play through Elden Ring, it was an event people were excited for because it was a game praised by many people for how good it was, being played by a large streamer, which made more people and even other streamers want to play Elden Ring. But when those viewers watch streamers play games like Alt F4 or Getting Over It or a difficult game about climbing or Jump King or, those type of games, really, they're watching the reactions more so from the streamers, finding those reactions more fun to watch than to actually play them. If you have people wanting to play a game after watching footage, then that's a good sign that you're in the right direction. Don't aspire to be like the viral games that get their moment in the viewer's spotlight and then gets forgotten afterwards, but something that's looked at fondly, something that is well crafted, something that you're proud of. How do you make a game fun to play though? Well, if nothing else, just nail the 30-second loop. Bungie, back when they first made Halo Combat Evolved, emphasized the importance of nailing the first 30 seconds of your gameplay. Once they had a fun 30-second loop, then they were able to build an entire game around it. This loop also enabled players to actually improve and get better over time, instead of tricking players into thinking that they got better after obtaining an item that lets them just destroy everything. The discovery of powerful methods or items should come from the willingness to experiment, to think outside of the box, rather than having it placed as a convenient device that lets you cancel the challenge presented to you. If Halo or Doom Eternal gave you all of the bells and whistles from the get-go, then the game's progressive challenge would be ruined. Same goes for other types of games that give you a progressive approach to obtaining more powerful gear and items. And another important thing too is to not make the game design to want to kill the player, but to be designed to be a good game first and foremost. If your game is fun to play first, then the challenges can be built around it to enhance the fun. And that's all I have. I don't have all of the pieces of the puzzle, and this is a skewed take, but it was something on my mind and I wanted to talk about the subject anyways. Our minds are fickle when it comes to challenging games. Sometimes we want something masochistically hard, and sometimes we want something more laid back and relaxed. But we don't all want to beat our heads against the wall and waste our time. And as we get older, this becomes more important to realize. If a game stops being fun, then it's no longer worth the effort. It's really that simple. There's no reason at all to slave your way through something you don't enjoy anymore, and this is coming from someone who would beat games for the sake of beating them, regardless of whether I enjoyed them or not. Whether you agree or disagree with my takes or my points, feel free to place your input in the comment sections. I'm always open to changing my mind if it's something I've misunderstood or something I haven't taken into consideration. Either way, make sure you're having fun with your project, have fun with the game itself that you're playing. If not, then don't bother with it and move on to something else.